To work along with this course, you will need a few applications. You will need a text editor or an IDE, a terminal, and the Vue DevTools plugin, which is available for Google Chrome and Firefox. You can use whatever editor or IDE you want to. Popular editors are Sublime Text, Atom, VS Code, and WebStorm. I will use WebStorm during this course, and I recommend you that you download their free trial because it works great with Vue and a lot of other JavaScript frameworks. If you prefer a free editor, I recommend VS Code. WebStorm has great support for Vue.js, but if you are using another editor, you will most likely need to install an extension for Vue.js to get syntax highlighting and other handy features. For VS Code specifically, there is an official Vue extension called Vetour. Fortunately, a Vue extension exists for every popular editor or IDE, so you can use the one that you feel the most comfortable with. I have put together a list of editors and plugins in the description below this video. We will also need a terminal. If you are on Mac or Linux, then you already have a terminal installed. I am on Mac and I use iTerm because it gives me some extra productivity features. An equally good terminal is Hyper.js. Hyper.js is entirely built with JavaScript and it is available for Mac, Linux, and Windows. So, you have some options if you would like to try something other than the default terminal. I guess you already have a browser, and just so you know, I will be using Google Chrome during the course. I strongly recommend you to install Vue DevTools, which is an extension for Chrome and Firefox that helps us debug Vue.js applications. You can install it for free directly from Firefox or Chrome Web Store. It will be very helpful later on, and I can't imagine debugging the application without it. By the time of the recording, Vue 3 is only supported by the Vue DevTools beta version, so I will be using that. Find the most up-to-date link in the description of this lesson. We have linked the beta version now, and we will update it when Vue DevTools stable adds support for Vue 3. In general, it doesn't matter which tools you decide to work with. It will be easy to follow along anyhow. If you are implementing Vue in an existing application or using it as a small part of your website, you can include it from a CDN. But when you are going to create a single-page application from scratch, you will benefit from starting your project using the official command line tool Vue CLI. Vue CLI creates a boilerplate application so you can start developing immediately. In order to use it, we need to have installed Node.js, a package manager like npm or yarn, and Git. Node.js is an open source environment for developing server-side and networking applications. Before, we only had the possibility to run JavaScript client-side on a visitor's browser, but now we can run it server-side as well. This opens up a lot of exciting opportunities. NPM stands for Node Package Manager. A package manager lets you install open source and private libraries, and it also helps you with automated tasks like keeping track of dependencies and other things. To install Node and NPM, you can visit nodejs.org, navigate to the download page, and grab the one for your operating system. You have the option to go with a long-time support version or with the latest stable one. The latest stable will get you access to the newest goodies as soon as possible. The LTS version will be getting updates for about 30 months for the developers that have not upgraded to a newer version. Feel free to choose any of these, it won't make a difference. Once installed, open your terminal and type node-v and npm-v. If everything worked, you will see the installed versions. If these commands don't work, then you might need to restart your terminal or even your computer if you are on Windows. Yarn is an alternative package manager to NPM. It used to be faster and have more features than NPM, but today both package managers have about the same speed and offer almost the same features. So using NPM or Yarn doesn't make a difference in the course and very likely in your work too. I will be mainly using NPM in this course, but feel free to go with Yarn if you prefer. The last thing you need is Git. Git is a version control system that, among other things, tracks changes in your code and makes it easy to collaborate with other developers. If you are on Mac, there is a chance that you have Git installed by default. On Windows, if you use Git Bash, you already have Git. If you are not sure if Git is installed, you can run git ---- version in your terminal. To install it or to download the latest version, you should go to git-scm.com and navigate to the download section. Then grab the one for your system, follow the installer, and you are good to go. Now that we have everything we need, we can install the Vue CLI. To install Vue CLI globally, we will run npm install -g at vue/cli or yarn global add at vue/cli. To follow along with the course, you must ensure that the Vue CLI tool is on version 4 or higher. Otherwise, you will not be able to create Vue 3 applications. Once Vue CLI is installed, you will have access to the Vue command everywhere in your terminal. To verify that it is installed, you can run vue ---- version and you will see the installed version, which should be 4.something. If you already had Vue CLI installed and you have an older major version, then make sure you upgrade it to the latest version. To upgrade Vue CLI, you may need to uninstall it first. To uninstall an npm package, we can use the uninstall command. In this case, that would be npm uninstall -g at vue/cli. The -g flag stands for global and must be used when the package is globally installed. If you are watching from the future and you are using a newer version, there might be some differences in comparison with the lessons. When the next major version of the Vue CLI is released, we will upgrade together. Now that you have Vue CLI installed globally, you can run the Vue command in your terminal to see all the options that Vue CLI provides. As you can see, Vue CLI can do quite a lot. During the course, we will explore and use most of these commands. In the next lesson, we will use Vue CLI to create our application. Now that we have installed Vue CLI, we can use it to scaffold our project. Vue CLI will give us a pre-configured boilerplate that comes with a lot of goodies to kickstart our project. Of course, you could configure a project from scratch, but using a boilerplate will save you a lot of time so you can focus only on your code. To bootstrap a new application with Vue CLI, we need to call the Vue create command. This command accepts an argument, which is the name of the app that will be created. First, the Vue CLI creates a folder with the same name as the name of the app, and then the Vue 3 app will be created inside the folder. Let's open our terminal and navigate to the folder where we are planning to bootstrap our Vue project. My folder, where I place my projects, is called code. If you want to create the project in the current directory without creating a subfolder, you can call it with a dot instead of the project name, like this, vue create dot. Since I want a new folder to be created, I will pass my project name here to the create command. Feel free to choose any name you like. I will call mine Vue School Forum. Now that the process started, you will go through a list of questions that will help you configure the application details. The first question will ask us which preset we are going to use. Since we are creating a Vue 3 application, we will select default Vue 3 preview. If your future applications have different requirements, you can choose one of the other presets. Let's wait a bit while Vue CLI downloads and validates the components it needs to generate the application. Depending on your NPM cache and network conditions, it might take from a few seconds up to a minute. If you wanted to customize the bootstrapped application, you would choose manually select features and you would get more configuration options. For us, Vue 3, Babel, and ESLint are perfect. Now that the app creation is done, we can view our first application in the browser by navigating to our new project folder and running npm run serve or yarn serve. And congratulations! You have created a Vue 3 application. I have opened the project we just created in my IDE. Now let's explore the structure. The node modules directory contains the downloaded modules our project uses. Every time we install a new library using npm or yarn, it ends up in here. The public folder contains static files that will be generated during the build process and placed into the build directory. This folder also includes an important file, the index.html. The index file is the page template where our Vue instance will be running. Here we see this div with the ID of app where the Vue app will be attached. Next, the src directory contains our application's code. The components directory is where our components will live. Initially, it comes with a hello world component that displays the list of useful Vue links that we see when we open our application in the browser. Here is where we will place the components that we create. The assets folder is intended for storing various static files that your application will use, such as images and style sheets. The files you place in the assets directory, opposite to the assets in the public directory, will be processed by Webpack. This makes them flexible and will be minified, encoded, cleaned up, and so on when you are building the application for production. So the assets in here are a part of your source code. The app.vue file is the so-called root component and is the Vue component instance that will have all the other components in it. Think of app.vue as the body tag of an HTML page. Currently, app.vue imports the hello world component and displays it in its template along with a Vue.js logo. The app component can also be used to contain global styling for the application. We will learn more about the root component in future lessons. The main.js file is the application's entry file. Here is where we initialize our Vue application instance. Later, when we will be adding more functionality, such as routing, state management, etc., this file will be used for instantiating and connecting the plugins to our Vue application. And that's the overview of the src directory. Next, we have some configuration files. Let's take a look at our package.json. The package.json file holds general information about the project, like the name, the version, and so on. The scripts property is an object of aliases for the commands we can run in the terminal, using yarn or npm run and the name of the command. For example, npm run serve will invoke the Vue CLI to start running the project in the development mode. If your editor supports it, you can run a script directly from here and see what happens. You can always add your own script shortcuts to run specific tasks in your project. Later in package.json, we have the list of the libraries we are using in the project. This one is filled by Vue CLI while creating a new project. Later, when we will add more dependencies by using npm install, packages will be automatically added to the list. The dev dependencies are the packages our project relies on while developing and are not needed when running in production. Besides those, package.json may contain other settings related to the project, such as the repository address, license information, settings of the linter, preferred Node.js version, and so on. You can check out the npm documentation for more information. The root directory also contains other configuration files, like the bubble configuration and the git ignore that tells Git which files to exclude from versioning. There is nothing else you need to know here in order to start coding. Before we dive into the code, there is one topic I would like to talk a bit more about, and that is linting. This and the next lesson are optional. So, if you don't want to or you feel uncomfortable linting your application, you can safely skip them. A linter is a utility software that programmatically reviews an application and reports suspicious code to the author. As a result, it reduces bugs and increases the quality and consistency of your code. There will be times when linting will annoy you to death, but linting will also save your future ass from deploying a horrible bug with a potential catastrophic consequence. In this lesson, we will talk about the JavaScript linter ESLint and some general pros and cons to get you familiarized with the subject. In a nutshell, ESLint checks your code and yells at you every time it notices a mistake. To get started, let's take a look at how ESLint works. There is an online demo where we can check it out. I will paste some code here that technically works and see the error messages on the right. The first thing we see is a parsing error. The keyword const is reserved. That's because const comes in ES6 and ESLint is not aware that we are using ES6. Let's take a look at the configuration. The first option is ECMA version, so let's switch that to 6. ECMAScript 6 is also called ECMAScript 2015. Now, the parsing error went away, and we get a handful of linting errors. The first error, for instance, says that the name variable is assigned to a value but never used. This error is coming from the no one used vars rule. If you open that rule in a new tab, you can see a lot of information about it. You can configure ESLint based on your needs, and you can find all the rules and explanations on the ESLint website. Luckily, you don't need to choose all the settings and rules you want on your own because there are standard sets of rules available. A set of rules is called a preset. There is a preset provided by the ESLint organization called ESLint Recommended, and it includes all the rules that have this checkmark on the left. Okay, but we don't want to paste our code directly on eslint.org every time we want to lint it. Of course, we can install and run ESLint locally. For now, let's see how we use ESLint in our project. The three popular ways of using ESLint are via the command line, integrated in your code editor, and as a loader in Webpack. I find the first option to slow my workflow. And while I like to have ESLint integrated into my editor, I prefer to also use a Webpack loader to ensure that I don't miss anything. As you might have heard, it is pretty easy to integrate ESLint with the Vue CLI. In fact, our Vue CLI project comes with ESLint installed by default. I have opened our newly created project in my IDE, that is WebStorm. If you open your package.json file and look for ESLint, you will see that our Vue 3 application also comes with some configuration for ESLint. This configuration lives under the ESLint config option. The pieces that you will most likely need to change, if you have specific requirements, are the extends option and the rules. Extends is an array of the active presets, also known as collections of rules. As you see here, by default, our application extends the ESLint recommended preset that activates all the rules we saw on the ESLint website that had the checkmark on the left. Notice here that our application also extends the plugin Vue 3 Essential, that is a collection of rules specific to Vue.js code. You can review these rules on the official Vue ESLint plugin website. I will put the link in the description of this lesson. If you decide to use another preset after some time, that's fine, you can come in here and change these values. But be aware that you will also have to install the new preset. The rules option includes a list of rules that you want to adjust. When you're working with a preset, your rules will override the preset's rules. One thing that I usually need during development is to define variables that I don't use. The ESLint recommended preset doesn't allow that. In order to disable this rule, I will add a new property with a rule name, and then I can set it to off. What I need here is the name of the rule. When working with ESLint, it is easy to find the name of the rule that you want to alter, since it is always provided along with the error. Let's define an unused variable within AppView to see what happens. In the browser, we now get an error coming from ESLint. Here we can see the name of the rule. You can then adjust it in your project settings or search for it on the ESLint documentation to learn more. Before disabling a rule, make sure to check this page on eslint.org to see why this rule applies and make sure that you really want to disable it. If you can't find the link for a rule, you can always browse the list of available rules or use the search. Back to our configuration file. The name of the rule I want to disable is noUnUsedVars. Each rule has 3 states: error, warn, and off. If I want to disable it, I will set it to off. Since it is nice to see a warning to remind me that I might have forgotten an unused variable somewhere, I prefer to get a warning. Instead of the state names, we could also use the integer equivalents, which are 2 for error, 1 for warn, and 0 for off. I will set it to 1 for warn. Let's check again in the browser, but first we have to restart the development server in order for our changes to take effect. We now get the warning in our terminal. But in the browser, we don't get the overlay that's breaking the application anymore. That's great. Accordingly, if I set the rules value to 0, we won't see any warnings. Actually, I like to have unused variables during development, but I want to keep my code clean for production. So, I can set the rules value conditionally. If the application is being built for production, I want this rules value to be error. But if it's being built for development, I want it to be a warning. Sadly, this would not work inside the JSON file because it is not valid JSON syntax. What we can do to implement that is to use a dedicated configuration file. If you want to have the ESLint configuration options in their own file, you can create a file called eslint.rc.jes in the root directory of your project. Don't forget to add the starting dot here. ESLint will automatically pick up the settings from the eslint.rc file. I will move our linting rules and settings from package.json in here. As this is a JavaScript file, we need to export our configuration object. And that should do the trick. By the way, don't worry if this part of the code doesn't look familiar. You could easily find this condition on your own if you googled for something like different ESLint rules based on environment. Ta-da! Okay, now running npm run serve works just fine, but npm run build will fail because the noUnUsedVars rule is not followed. When you configure your own rules, you should try as hard as possible to learn and adapt to the presets rules you are using instead of immediately disabling every rule you don't follow. You can configure all the ESLint rules you need on your own using a configuration file. But luckily, you don't need to pick all the settings you want because there are standard sets of rules available. A set of ESLint rules is called a preset. It is recommended to use a preset rather than creating a custom set of rules from scratch. There are many benefits, and some worth mentioning are that big companies often require that you follow their preset, and by being accustomed to linting with presets, you will be able to easily adapt to any sets of rules. The popular presets ensure quality code because thousands of developers have used them and the community have polished and updated the rules together. It is also easier to collaborate with other developers, and you might learn a thing or two from the warnings as you code without spending time to study. So sometimes, presets are also a source of knowledge. The most popular ESLint presets are Standard and Airbnb. There are some major differences between these two. I have gathered the most common rules in a table to compare them. Both presets require two spaces for indentation. In comparison to Airbnb, the standard preset doesn't allow semicolons. Both presets enforce single quotes for string and strict equality, and in both presets we can't have trailing commas. You can take a look at each preset's documentation for a detailed explanation and choose the one that you like the best. The best way to learn and understand the preset is to install it and run it against your code. By default, our Vue 3 application uses the ESLint recommended preset. In this lesson, I will show you how to install and use my favorite preset, that is the one called Standard. There are many ways to install it and set it up. I will show you the way I consider the simplest, that is using the Vue CLI. Vue CLI has its own plugin system, and there are lots of plugins available. To add or change a preset, we can add again the ESLint plugin by running vue add ESLint. Once this runs, it will ask us which preset we want, and Standard is one of the options. So I will choose that and give it a minute. We got some errors here. Let's investigate. The errors are coming from the ESLint.rc file. So let's see what's going on there. It seems that the Vue CLI got confused, and instead of merging the new options, it added the properties again, which creates all the errors. Remember that Vue 3 is very new when I record this video, so Vue CLI might perform better for you. In case you get the same problem with me, you will need to remove the duplicate keys. If it just works, then you are good to go. To fix the errors in the ESLint file, I will keep the new settings and move over what we had initially. For the extents, we will need the Vue 3 plugin and the Vue standard. So I will delete the ESLint recommended. I will take this array and put it in a new object with the key extents into the newest properties that Vue CLI has added to this file. So I will copy it, I will paste it here, and I will remove the quotes. Let's see what we got next. I will remove the root as this was meant to be the extents option. I will also remove the env since we have it in our new object in the bottom. I will remove the extents now that I have copied it over, and I will also remove the parser options because it is the same with what Vue CLI has added in the bottom. Lastly, I got this rules option where I want to get a warning in development and an error on production. So I will copy that in the new rules option instead of the warn that they have here as the default. And with that, we should be good to go. To test if the standard preset has been applied, I will add some more indentation to this line and expect to get an error. And that's the case. Notice that I get the ESLint error directly in the IDE and I can fix it before I try to run the application. This means that we have successfully installed and switched over to the standard preset. But let's also try to run it in the browser. I will make an error again. In the terminal, I will run npm run serve. Awesome, we get an ESLint error in our terminal, and we can also see this overlay in our application. So there is no way we can miss it. We have some options on how to fix the errors. One option is of course to fix them manually. Another option, which is very handy when you have many errors in many files, is to run npm run lint --fix. This command will try to fix as many errors as possible, and it will let you know if you need to take any additional actions yourself. Okay, perfect. This is how you install and customize an ESLint preset in your Vue 3 application. In this lesson, we will review the initialization code to understand how our Vue application is created and how it is mounted to the DOM. This lesson is optional, so if you are not interested in learning that, feel free to proceed with the next one. Let's open the main.js file where all these are happening. Let's have a closer look at the initialization syntax. What happens here is that the createApp function takes a root component, appView, as an argument and returns what we call a Vue instance. The argument, appView, in our example, is called the configuration object. Once we have a Vue instance, we have to mount it on an HTML element. In this case, we mount it to the DOM element with an ID of app. This is the element I showed you in our index.html file. In Vue 2, we had to specify an L property in the config object. But in Vue 3, we now have to use the mount function instead. Our Vue application will live inside the element it mounts to, and it will only have access to the children of this DOM element. This makes Vue very powerful and progressive, as it gives us a way to refactor and migrate functionality gradually. We could reuse this Vue instance later in the code for additional configuration, before we mount the application. To show you, I will create a variable forum app to store our Vue instance. To mount our instance on the DOM, we can call forumapp.mount. This way, we have the option to extend and configure our instance before we mount it to the DOM. For example, we can register a global component using the component instance function. Or we can install a plugin using the use instance function. This is how we will install plugins like Vuex and VueRouter later on. Let's see why the new syntax is great. The entire component tree, mounted by the application instance, shares the same context. This means that all the components of our application will have access to whatever we define here, including plugins, directives, global components, and so on. This syntax is actually quite similar to the syntax we used in Vue 2 applications. However, in Vue 2, it was impossible to isolate some of the functionality to only one of the Vue instances without it affecting the others, since the Vue applications were still using the same Vue object once imported from the library. That was problematic when isolation was important, like for example in unit testing. The new syntax in Vue 3 allows us to make the configuration of each application as an individual custom object, since the apps are configured using a dedicated method, the createApp, which creates new independent instances. This design trick gives us the possibility to have two or more isolated Vue instances that do not share any features by default, even if they are created in one file. I will create another Vue application to show you. I will call it another Vue app. To create the instance, I will use the createApp function and I will give it a component. Since I don't have another component here, I will give it app. So now that we have a new instance, the Another View app, we can use another plugin here. Like, let's say that we have another plugin. And then, when we are happy with the configuration of the Another View app, we can eventually mount it to the DOM. And here we can specify the ID of the DOM element where we want to mount it. So this can be the Another app, let's say. And this way, we can have two different view applications or view component trees. One that will live in the div with the ID of app, and it will have this instance and this configuration and all the components that are defined here, and another view application that lives on the Another app element, and it has this configuration. So here we have two totally independent view instances that mount on different elements, and they don't share any functionality unless we specifically want them to. I hope this explanation is useful. I will delete the second application as we don't need it, and I will clean up our forum app initialization code. We don't need any global settings or plugins for now. Finally, I will serve the application in the browser to ensure that I didn't break anything. Before we dive into creating our forum components, pages, routes, and whatnot, we should decide how our data will look like and what the source will be. A common forum consists of threads, posts, and users. The Vue.js forum, for example, has also some channels here on the left. Inside the channels, we can find the threads. Think of the thread as a stream of posts, where the first post is the content of the thread, while the rest are the thread's replies. To get started with developing our own forum, we can go with a JSON file that will contain all the data. Later in this course, we will use the Google Cloud Firestore as our dynamic data source, but for now, we will be fine with static data. Let's see how we would like a thread object to be. Firstly, it needs a unique ID or key so we are able to distinguish it and find it. It definitely needs a title and a created at or a published at property that will include the timestamp of when the thread was created. Each thread should also include its posts. This property will be an array. Lastly, it should include the ID of the user who started the thread. We can name this property user ID. I will leave this empty for now. This is enough to get us started. So, I will create a JSON object that will be our central store, and I will add a threads property. The threads property can be an array or an object. I prefer to have it as an array where each element can be found by its unique ID. You might think that the posts can live in the threads post property, but it's better not to have them nested here so it's easier to access them later. Thus, I will add the posts property to our root object. That again will be an array. I will mock a post object here that will have an ID of p1. Each post should have an ID, a published at property, and a user ID, similar to the threads. Additionally, it should have a text property that will include the content of the post. The post also needs a thread ID property that will tell which thread owns this post. Here I will use the ID of the thread we have, which is t1. Okay, we can go on and create the users. I will add the users property that will contain our first user. Users can have dozens of details like email, name, Twitter handle, website, and many more. For now, I will just add a name and an ID. Assuming that this user created the post and the thread we have, I will use its ID for the threads and posts user ID property. If you are used to MongoDB or another non-relational database, you might be used in having the posts and the threads nested into the user objects. On the other hand, if you use SQL or another relational database, you might be used in having the foreign key only in the related resources. In the Google Cloud Firestore, which we will use as our final database, we have a lot of options. We found that the simplest yet performant solution is to only have the user ID within the related resources. We can easily get the count of posts for a user by simply filtering through posts and finding the ones that have the same user ID. Let me show you. Here, for example, to find all the posts of our user, we would do data, posts, filter, and then we will filter the posts that have user ID equal to U1. Later on, we will perform a query in our database. There are of course a lot of options on how to design your database, and you are free to choose any structure that suits you best. But we highly recommend following the approach we do here for the course, so it is easy for you to follow along. If you feel adventurous, you are welcome to try another structure and let us know how that worked for you. With the basic resources in place, we can create forums and categories. A forum is a group of threads, and a category is a group of forums. For instance, a category discussions can include forums like pets, fishing, and cooking. Each of these forums will include threads related to this topic. With this in mind, we can add the forums to our data object. We need an ID, a name, a description, a category ID to connect them with the categories next, and a threads property that will include the keys of the threads. Next, the categories. They can be simpler and have only an ID, a name, and the forums property. Now, all our objects are connected with each other using foreign keys. I notice I missed the brackets for the post object, so I will fix it now. Let me show you quickly how we will be able to access one of our resources and its relationships in our code. I will copy-paste my data object in the browser console to play around. To find the thread using an ID, we will do data.threads.find, and then we will look for the thread whose ID is equal to T1 in this case. This way, we can access the thread object we are looking for. Now, if we want to find the posts that belong to this thread, we have to filter the posts based on the thread ID property. Notice that we should do filter and not find, because find will only return the first result that meets our criteria, while filter will return all of the results. Thus, the returned post is inside an array. So this is how we will utilize our data store. In order to start building our application and have enough examples to work with, we have prepared some dummy data in this format that you can download from GitHub. You can create your own if you want to, but you will have to add new properties constantly as our application grows. The data we have prepared include more information than the ones we saw in this lesson, but the logic is the same. We will review them in the course when we will need to use them. Feel free to ignore them until now. Before I close this lesson, I will go in our project and I will create a file under the src directory that I will call data.json. I will place the seed data in here. Make sure to download this file and place it in your src directory before the next lesson. The first thing to do before being able to render any data on a page is to have access to some data. When you start building an application, it is usually handy to work with a local file or mocked data before hitting a remote API or another source. In this lesson, we will learn how to import and use data from JSON files. To start using the data we have in our data.json file, we can import it in one of our components. Let's open the Hello World component and go to the top of the script section. Here I will use the import ES6 statement. The import statement syntax is import name from path to file. This is the name of the local variable that will contain the imported code. You can import a JavaScript class, a single function, a variable, or an object, and so on. In our case, I will name the local variable source data, and the file path is src/data.json. Since the file lives outside of the components directory, we can use the relative path, which would be ../data, or use the special @ symbol that represents the src directory. Using the @ symbol instead of relative paths is recommended as it unifies imports in all components. Using the shorthand also makes it easy to refactor in the future if you decide to organize your components in a different way. So my import statement will be import source data from @/data.json. To ensure that we have actually imported the data, we can log them in the console right after the import statement. Now, when the page is reloaded, let's open the console and take a look. As we expect, source data has a key for threads, posts, users, and so on. Now, let's display some of our data in our HTML. Vue templates naturally support JSON data, so you can just type it in your template. To be able to display data in a components template like this, we need to declare this data in our components data option. The data option is a function that returns an object like this. Here I will call our local data source data, the same that I reference in the template. If we check back in the browser, we can see our data object being displayed in full here. That's great. If we wanted to display just the threads object, we could either do that in the template or just map the threads in our data. To map just the threads, here we would do threads::source_data.threads. And this way, we can display the full threads object in the browser. In this lesson, we will create the first page of our forum, the home page. We will also learn how to loop through lists and render list items on the page. Let's start with creating a new component that will represent our home page. I will call my component page home. In my editor, WebStorm, there is this option to create a Vue component. This will add the .vue file extension, and it will also create the skeleton of template, script, and style. If you are using VS Code, you can create a Vue component file, and you can also have this boilerplate using Vector. The template, script, and style blocks form the SFC. SFC stands for Single File Component. Single File Components are special Vue files that allow us to have both template, JavaScript, and CSS in one file. One of the best practices in Vue applications is to give your components good names. But what makes a component name good? This answer, along with many other best practices we will refer to during this course, are listed in the Vue Style Guide. The Vue Style Guide is a set of recommendations battle-tested by the Vue core team and thousands of developers in their Vue projects over the last years. There are 4 groups of suggestions. Priority A rules, essentials, are a must-have. These rules help you prevent bugs in your applications. Take some time to read them and know their existence. Even if you don't learn them all now, you can come back later when you need them and learn one in detail. The strongly recommended and recommended rules are almost always a good idea. Lastly, priority D, use with caution, are rules that their applicability depends on the use case. The first priority A rule is about naming components. Component names should always be multi-word, except for root app components and built-in components provided by Vue, such as transition or component. This prevents conflicts with existing and future HTML elements, since all HTML elements are a single word. Since we are developing a home page, I use the words home and page. In addition to that, I use the page as a prefix to provide a self-explanatory grouping for all future components that will represent separate pages. For example, page home, page login, page search, etc. For a component file to be used and rendered, we need to connect it to a parent component. We have the app view as our root component. So to display the newly created page home component in our app, we need to import it there. To do that, we will first switch to app view and use the import statement to import it. Now, we need to register the page home component in the special property called components. By doing this, we let the Vue compiler know about custom tags that will be present in our template markup. The key is the name of the element we want to use to render the component in the markup. For us, that will be page home. And the value is the actual component itself. Since both the key and the value are the same, we can use the ES6 object property shorthand. And the last thing we need to do is to add our component to the template. When we add a custom element to the template, it's recommended to use kebab case. So, our element will be page-home. You can also use Pascal case. But since HTML is case insensitive, many people prefer kebab case. Let's check the browser to see if it's imported correctly. Here we have an error. Failed to compile. The template requires child element. So we get an error because our page home component doesn't have a template. So let's add one. Hello from page home. If we check back in the browser, our component is now rendered properly in the bottom of the page. Great. I will remove all the references to the Hello World component from app view to clean up our page. Great. Now we can go back to page home and implement the data in the markup. Our goal for the home page for now is to display the threads and the posts in a form of a conversation. Let's import our data.json in our component. Next, I will add the data function to the component. Remember that the data function is needed to define the initial data that the component will have. In Vue 3, the data property must be a function that returns an object. In Vue 2, it was also possible for data to be an object, which was a bad practice. So in Vue 3, data must always be a function. In the return statement of the data function, I will create a threads property and set it to data.threads. Next, let's go to the template to add our threads. This time, we want to create one element for each thread and not display all the threads in one object as we did in app view. I will create a div and use v4 to loop through the threads. The v4 directive is used to render lists of items represented as an array or an object. The v-for directive requires a special syntax in the form of v-for item in items, where items is the source data array and item is an alias for the current element. In our case, the array is called threads. The local element can be called anything we like, even just item, but I will call it thread as that's what this item really is. Inside each div, I will add an h2 element to print out the thread title inside. Let's switch to the browser to see the output. Here we get an error because elements in iteration expect to have vbind key directives. Do you know what this means? It means that Vue is complaining because we didn't specify a key for its div. Whenever you render a list of elements, you should pass the key attribute in order to help Vue keep track of the list. The key should be unique for each element. Here we have access to the thread ID that is unique for each thread, so I will use that. If we check back in the browser, you can see that it works now. And here we can see all the titles of the threads we have in our data.json. In a real-world forum, you may expect more sophisticated information on the page, such as what posts are in the thread and who wrote them. So, let's add this to the homepage template for now. First, I will enhance our component data section with posts and users. A thread usually has multiple posts within it, so let's add another div inside the thread element and use v-for again to loop through the posts this time. Here it will be post ID in thread.posts. That's because we have the IDs inside the thread object and not the whole post. Let's also add the key equal to post ID. Inside here, we have access to the post ID, which we can use to find the actual post. Let's create a paragraph tag to print out the post text. To do so, we will need to search in our posts array for the post with a corresponding ID. We can do this at first using the arrayFind method directly in the template. The find method returns the value of the first element in the provided array that satisfies the provided testing function. If no value satisfies the testing function, undefined is returned. To display the content of the post, we will use its text property. We can chain it directly to the find method call. Let's see if that works. It does. So notice now how we have the thread title, and within each thread we have the 3 or 4 related posts here. Okay, let's go back to the editor and also display the author's name. We can get the name from the user's data, and we have the user ID on the post object. We can do this very long find here to get the user, and once we get to that, we can display the username. And now, inside the thread, before its post, you can see the user that wrote it. This code looks way too complex, right? As we can't persist calculated data in the template's logic, we have to have those repeated and inefficient arrayFind function calls. Is there a more efficient way to work with data structure in Vue? Yes, of course there is. We can do it in several ways actually, but for now, let's approach that by introducing methods that will contain this search logic and can be reused across the component code. Methods is a special property on the component instance. You can access these methods directly on the Vue instance or use them in directive expressions. All methods will have their this context automatically bound to the Vue instance. Let's create 2 methods that will do the search for post and for user and return the found item. This function will find the post using its ID, so it needs to get the post ID as the argument. We can directly access component data using this. So we can do this.posts.find and find the post that has the specified ID. Great, I will do the same for the user. Now we can improve our template to have function calls instead of the search logic directly. Here we still need to access the post ID. Now let's check how the page looks. Nothing changed in the UI, but we have improved our code organization in the component. We now reuse the logic code in the methods, and we have made the template code easier to read. When you are developing a web application, it's common to have a template coming from a designer or to use a theme from an online marketplace. Most likely, these templates will come with a styles file and a mockup, usually some static HTML files. The styles file could be Sass, Less, CSS, or even something else. For the forum application, we have prepared the mockups along with the CSS file. Make sure to download these files. You will find the link in the description of this lesson. The first thing we have to do is to import the CSS in our application. So I will copy the CSS file and I will put it under public/style CSS. There are various ways to add styling to a Vue application. We will start with including a link for the CSS file inside our root index.html file. This will import the whole list of styles from the file. To structure our HTML properly, I will open up the thread.html file on the browser and inspect the elements. The container div has a class of container. So, within our root component template, app_vue, I will create a div with a class of container and I will wrap the rest of the markup. The next thing to do is to structure the contents of the page home component according to the design. To help myself, I will copy the HTML code from the browser and I will update these static values with our dynamic values. Let's see what we got here. On top we have the breadcrumbs. I will delete this for now. Next we have this h1, which is a thread title. This div contains all the thread information, so we would want to create one of these for each of the threads we display in the home page. Thus, I will copy our v4 here. Great. This is the title of the thread, so I will replace it with our dynamic value. Here we have some information regarding the author of the thread that we will look into later. For now, I will remove them. Here we have the post list, which is a list of all the replies of the thread. So here we will want to create one div with the class of post for each thread post. To do that, I will copy the v4 we created in our initial template. I will place it here for a bit so I can easily copy-paste the dynamic values. So here we want to create one div with the class of post for each post in the thread posts array. Awesome. Here we have the user info, where we want to display the name of the user that wrote the post. We have that here, so I will copy-paste it inside the static value. Because we don't have links for the profile page yet, I will replace this with a hash. I will do that for every link that we don't have the route yet. This is the image that is the avatar of the user that wrote the post. We haven't used this value yet, but we can easily implement it now. To make a dynamic binding for an attribute in our HTML, we use the colon symbol, which is the shorthand for vbind. Here, instead of the static URL, we want to display the avatar URL of the user. We have this value in the avatar property of each user. So here we have this code that will bring us the user object that created the post, and then we can access the value that we are looking for, in this case, the avatar. Next up, we have some stats related to the user. For now, we'll remove the last two, and I will keep the posts in case we want to implement it soon. And here we have the post content. This is the actual text that the user wrote and wanted to send as a reply or as a thread. We have this value here where we get the text property of the post. Then we have a button here that allows the user to edit the thread that I will remove for now. We don't have the formatted date yet, but we can have the published at property of our post for now. The reactions are a lot of fun, but I will also remove for now since we are still just getting started. Great, then we have other posts, but we don't want to hardcode this because we will create a new div with a class of post for every post in our posts array here. I will remove our previous code from the bottom of the template and let's see what we get in the browser. Awesome! We have this view logo on top that comes from our app view component, and we now have this nice presentation of our threads and posts that we get from our theme. This looks much better, right? If it doesn't work for you right after you have included the style sheet, you might need to give it a refresh since you have changed the index.html file. It is recommended to have as little global CSS as possible. This way, you only load the styles you really need, which means that your application becomes lighter and performs better. To get an idea how this would work in our application, we would have to define all the classes related to the thread and posts, like post item and post list, within our page home component. This way, our users will not load this CSS when they visit another page that doesn't need them, like for example the login page. To show you, I will cut all these rules related to the thread from the style CSS file. Then I will add a style tag in our page home component. And now I will put them in the style tag of our page home component. Now, if I switch back to the browser, you see that the output is the same, but these styles have been processed and extracted by a view loader into a style tag inside the HTML head. Since we do not have the components in place at the moment, I will keep the CSS global temporarily. When our application is in shape, we can split the styles appropriately. It is also recommended to have the global styles in the root component's style tag instead of importing them in the HTML head tag as we have it now in our index.html file. Thus, we should move the style sheet from the static directory to src so it is processed by Webpack. This way, it will also be minified when we build our application for production. To achieve this, I will import the styles in app view in the style tag, and then I will remove the link tag from index.html. If we check in the browser now, we don't see a difference, but now the style sheet is part of our source code. Let me show you one immediate benefit we got by doing that. Right now, the CSS file is 47 kilobytes. I will build our application for production using the command npm run build. Once it is done, you can see now that the app CSS is roughly 36 kilobytes, while the initial style CSS file was 47. So the Vue CLI CSS loaders made the style sheet about 25% lighter by compressing it and removing any duplicate rules we might have. Before we move to the next lesson, you might wonder what styles you should have globally available. And that is of course up to you and your team. But the typical global styles would be styles related to standard HTML elements that will be used in many places of your application. For example, global styles would be related to text sizes, links, buttons, lists, images, and so on. And if your website is based on a CSS framework like Material Design or Bootstrap, you could make their essential classes available globally by importing them within your root component. If you want to import a style sheet from a Node module, you can target it using the tilde prefix that is provided by CSS Loader. So, to import Bootstrap CSS, for example, you could write import, then tilde bootstrap css / bootstrap CSS. You can do the same with Sass or less files. The Vue CLI loader supports all popular CSS preprocessors out of the box. Until now, we are rendering all the threads along with their posts in a single page. It seems like a good time to move on and create a page that will display a single thread. I would like to visit /thread/id, like /thread/5, and view the thread with a specified ID. To implement this, we are going to implement client-side routing using Vue Router. Vue Router is an official Vue.js plugin that maps components to routes and makes building single-page applications with Vue.js a breeze. If you are not familiar with Vue Router, I recommend that you watch our Vue Router for Everyone course. This course is taught by Debbie O'Brien. In the masterclass, we will get right into using Vue Router. So, if you want to brush up the router's functionality, you will find everything in our course dedicated to that. Excellent! Here I have opened the guide for the latest version of Vue Router that is compatible with Vue 3. At the time of this recording, Vue Router 4 is very new and the guide is available under next.router.vuejs.org. Make sure you are not browsing the old guide that is for Vue.js 2. Great, let's install it. I will copy paste this command in my terminal that will install Vue Router 4 using npm. Great, let's set it up now. I will put the guide side by side. I will do this installation inside the main.js file. As you see on the top, you first need to define some components that will be our route components. We already have one page, that is our home page. So I will import that. Great. Next we need to define some routes. I will copy this part from the guide. I will also break it into multiple lines to make it easier to read. This route object is defined for the path /, which is our homepage, and it requires a component to show when this path is visited. In our case, this component is page home. Next, we should create the router instance and pass the routes option. I will also copy this part from the guide as it looks a bit verbose. Let's remove the comments. So what this does is that it creates the router variable using the Vue Router create router function, and inside it passes the history mode that it is initially set to that, and the routes object that we get from here, or the routes array. In order to use Vue Router, we need to import it. So let's do that and import it from our npm package we just installed. Lastly, we need to tell our application to use the router we have created with this function. We can do that using the use method, that it's available under our app instance. We have called our app forum app, so here we will say forum app use router. Okay, I think this looks good. Let's check it out in the browser. We get an error here that says cannot read property create router of undefined. So this refers to this line where we use viewRouter.createRouter. The reason we get this error is because viewRouter doesn't export an object called viewRouter. Instead, it exports a collection of functions. If we're going to import it like that, we will have to say that we're going to import everything as viewRouter from viewRouter. Let's try that. And now our page is back. However, we are not using viewRouter yet. In order to put viewRouter in use, we have to use the router view component in our template. In our case, we should use it inside our root component appView, where we have created the div with the ID of container. This component will always render the active page based on the route the user is visiting. So when we are on the home page, router view will render the page home component. So I will delete this line. And I will also remove the references for page home from my script. Great. If we refresh the browser now, our application still works, but this time we are using the router view and not hard coding the page home component here. In the browser, you can also tell that we are using the router now because we get this hashtag in the URL. If you don't want to have the hashtag, you can change the history mode in the configuration to the HTML5 option using the create web history function. I recommend that you use the HTML5 history mode so your URLs look more natural. This setting, though, might require some configuration when you deploy to a server. I will leave a link for that in the description in case you need it. If we check back in the browser, it still works even when we don't have the hashtag in the URL. Awesome! Before we call this done, I want to give you a few tips. First of all, it's a good practice to give our route a name so we can easily reference it in our code. When we are using named routes, it is easier to refactor URLs in the future without having to update our application link. We will see more about this benefit later in this course. I will name our route home. Next, here we're importing the complete viewRouter library. It would be better to import only the functions we use and let Webpack delete the rest of the code that we don't need from our final application bundle. We can do that by importing create router and create web history from viewRouter. Notice that viewRouter is a minimal library, so the two functions we use are almost as big as the full plugin. However, we save 1 kilobyte, which is better than nothing. As we discussed in the previous lesson, we want to be able to visit /thread/id, like /thread/5, and view the thread with a specified ID. We are going to implement this in this video using viewRouter, which we now have installed and configured. Let's create a page component for displaying the thread. I will name this one page thread show. It might be tempting to name it just thread, but remember you should always use multi-word names for your components to prevent conflicts with existing and future HTML elements, since all HTML elements are a single word. Additionally, we could name our component just page thread, but we know we will have more pages related to the threads later, like for example page thread edit. At this point, it's perfectly fine if you prefer to go with page thread, but I will call mine page thread show because it's free and it reduces the chances I will need to refactor that later. The look of the thread page will actually be the same as the home page, with the only difference that it will display only one thread. So I will copy the template from home and the script, and I will remove the v4 from the root element. Inside the template, Vue expects that we have a thread object. Which is this thread in our case? The one that is specified in the URL when the users browse. So, we should set up the route configuration and come back to figure out how to find this thread here in our data source. I will add another route object here for our thread. The path will be /thread. I will give it a name of thread show for the reasons I mentioned before. And the component I want to connect it to is the page thread show. Notice how WebStorm imports that for me. Great. Now let's confirm in the browser that it works. If we visit /thread, we get an error because thread is not defined in our component. This is good and it means that our route works. Now let's try to grab the ID. In Vue Router, to create a dynamic route that will carry a parameter, we use the colon symbol. We specify the name of the param after the colon, and in our case the param is the ID of the thread we want to show. Okay, let's check back in the browser by visiting /thread/NID. Let's use Vue DevTools to inspect what's going on. Under our active component, page thread show, notice that we have a special $route property. In here, there is an option called params, which we can access from within our component. Here you can also see other useful information regarding the active route. Notice here that we have the ID and the value that is specified in the URL. If I change the URL, the param changes too. Great! So now that we have the ID from the route, we can access it in our component to find the thread. There are a lot of ways to implement that. I like to use a computed property because its value is cast and it will be reactive every time the ID changes. Inside the computed property or any other Vue instance method, we can access the params under this $route.params. In this case, the param we want to access is the ID. That should do the trick. Let's check again and use a valid ID this time in the browser. I got this one from the data.json file. Awesome! We got to see the specified thread. If we change the ID to another one, we get to see another thread. Fantastic! Before we go to the next lesson, I want to give you a small tip. Instead of using $route.params.id in our component, we can instruct Vue Router to pass the value of the parameter as a component prop to our component. This is a good practice for component self-documentation, as we will define the ID prop. It is also beneficial when it comes to testing, as the component is flexible and not tightly coupled to the router. To pass the ID as a parameter, we add props true to the route. In the page thread show component, we should define the ID prop that will be required and a string. This way, it's clear what our component needs and we don't have to read the full code to understand what parameter it uses and where we get the ID from. In our computed property, I will replace this route params ID with this ID. Back in the browser, everything works the same. As of now, we define the router configuration and our routes inside main.js. This is not wrong, but we could benefit from storing the configuration in another file that will be dedicated to routing. In Vue applications, it is common to have a directory under src called router and have the router configuration in a JavaScript file under that. I will create this router folder and an index.js file in there. Now let's see what we can move in here. I will cut the import statements of our page components, the functions from Vue router, the routes, and here that we create the new router. Great, everything seems to be fine here, but we have to export the router that we create so that we can import it in main.js and install it on our application. So here I will make this a default export. Back in main.js, we should import the router instance we just created. Because the file inside is called index.js, we can import it directly from @/router and we don't need to specify the file name if we don't want to. Awesome! This should work as it is. Let's give it a refresh and everything works fine. Now our main.js file is shorter. It's clear what it does. It creates an app, it installs router, and it mounts on the element with the ID of app. Our router file is also very straightforward. It imports the page components, it imports the functions we need from Vue router, and then we define the routes we need, and we're exporting a new router instance that includes the configuration and the routes. By now, we are displaying the complete threads on the home page, and we have the thread page that we have not linked anywhere yet. To give it a better shape, we can show a list of the threads in the home page and allow users to navigate to the thread they want to read. It's often beneficial to think about how you want to use a feature in your application before you start developing the components. I will open up our page home component, that is our homepage. Let's delete what we have in the template as we don't need it anymore. It would be nice to have a heading and use a component to display a list of threads instead of doing the v-for directly in the page home component. Something like a component called thread list would be nice for now. Let's create this thread list component under our components directory. In order to fill in the template, I will consult our mockup to copy the designed HTML. If you don't have a mockup for your project or the design is not important, you can just go ahead and create the divs and the other elements to create the feature you need. In our mockup directory, the page that contains a list of threads is the forum page. If you want to get familiar with the mockups we have provided you, feel free to open the several static files in your browser. This way, you will also get some spoilers of what's about to come. I will move on and open forum HTML in the browser. This element here with the title of threads is the list of threads I'm looking for. So I will copy this HTML code. Now I will paste the code inside our thread list component template. I will collapse the divs with the class of thread to get a better understanding of our markup. Outside the div with the class of thread list, we have a pagination element. It will take a while until we get to that, so I will remove it for now. So now we have a clean template for our list of threads. Each div with a class of thread represents a thread. Thus, I will delete all of them except of one that I will apply a v-for directive to create multiple elements dynamically based on the threads we have in our data. Sweet! Now let's see what we want to show within each thread. Here we want to show the thread title. I will again use the hashtag for the link, and I will show you how to implement the links later. In this element, we display the name of the user that created the thread. I will copy the script from page home to implement that quickly. Our helper method is called userById. Using our helper, we can find the user with the ID that is the same with thread user ID, and then grab its name. Here, instead of yesterday, we can have the thread published at property. The last element is about the recent activity. We don't know how to get these values besides of the replies count, so we can either delete the element or use the details of the thread temporarily. I prefer to use the thread details so our app looks more fun. Initially, I will get the replies count by using the length of the post property of our thread. For the avatar URL, I will use our helper, userById, and then grab the avatar property of the user. I will also use the name of the creator for the recent activity. And the published at property. That should be good. Let's check our work in the browser. It doesn't work. That's probably because we have not imported our component inside page home. Let's fix that. We should also define our component inside the components option. Let's check again. Great, we get the list, but we also get this strange value. Let's check that quickly. Right, so here, instead of showing the complete user object, we want to display just the user name. Fantastic! Here you can see the thread titles, the information of the user that created the thread, the count of the replies, and some information of when the thread and by whom was created. I notice here that I missed the word replies, so I will add that quickly. Perfect. Let's review what we have made. In the page home component, we are importing the thread list that renders all the threads. In the thread list, we create a div for each thread in our threads data. Our thread list component is now tightly coupled to our data.json file. No matter where we want to use this component, it will display all the threads that we have. This is not a good behavior for a component. We want our component to be reusable, so we are able to command it which threads to display. Then, in any place of our website we want to display a list of threads, we can import it and reuse it. To make that happen, we should make the component accept the threads as a prop instead of importing all the threads inside our component directly. Our threads prop should be type of array and always provided, so I will mark it as required. Now we should delete the threads data. We still need the posts and the users because we are searching into these arrays to find the related objects as we don't have an API to fetch data from yet. Now in the home page, we should delete what we don't need. If we try to render our list like that, we will get an error in the browser console because we have not passed the threads prop to our component that is required. The error that we get here signals that we did a good job defining our prop, so we know exactly why we don't see any threads. Perfect, let's pass the threads as a prop. Back in the browser, now we get the list with all available threads. Awesome. You might want to break your thread list component down to use a thread list item component that will include the logic for the single threads. That way, essentially the thread list responsibility would be just to create multiple instances of the thread list item component. If you have quite some logic for each item, and you think that would be beneficial for your project, this is a good practice to apply. In our case, the logic is pretty minimal yet, so I don't think that we need to break down the component for now. Thus, I will keep all the logic here. Feel free to create the thread list item component by yourself if you want to. We now have the list of threads in the home page, and we have a route that displays a single thread. In this lesson, we will link the list items with a thread page, so when a user clicks on a thread, they are redirected to read it. The path for the thread page is /thread/id. I will open the thread list component, that is the one we use in the home page to create the list. Here we already have a link element, so let's go on and make it functional. The first idea that comes in mind is to dynamically set the href attribute of the A tag to the route path. In this case, that would be /thread/the thread ID. Let's give it a shot in the browser. When we click the link, we are being redirected to the threads page, which is nice. But notice that the browser tries to reload the page. That should not happen in a single page application. To prevent the browser from reloading the page, we can use the router link component. The router link component is available in all router-aware components. Since we have injected the router in the root view instance in main.js, all our components are aware of the router. In order to render a link using the router link component, we have to pass it a to property. To can be a string with a path or an object. If I replace the A tag with router link and switch href with to, there won't be any difference in the rendered markup since router link renders an anchor tag by default. The router link component allows the navigation to take place on the client side, and we won't see the browser reloading. This way, navigation becomes much faster. We can improve our code by using the object syntax for the to property. Instead of passing the dynamic path directly as a string, we can also use an object with the name of the route and the required parameter. The required param we want to pass here is the ID param, and the value is the ID of the related thread. I will open our routes file to find the name we gave to our route. It is called thread_show. So our router link tag will be this: to name thread_show params ID thread ID. The output in the browser is the same, but we get two benefits by using the object syntax. Firstly, we get a small benefit that the link is easier to read and understand what data are being passed to the route and their purpose. Here we know, for instance, that the route requires the ID param. Secondly, and most importantly, when we are using a named route instead of the path, we can change the route's path in router index.js without having to update and refactor our application. Let me show you. I will change the thread show's path to /thread/show/id. If I switch back to the browser, without making any change in our code, notice that our links still work perfectly fine. Imagine how huge is that if you have hundreds of links in your code base that you would have to refactor. I want to note here that changing the paths can negatively affect your SEO if your application is public. Also, it can confuse your users and break links they have shared or stored. So have that in mind and try to keep your route paths as stable as possible. Let's switch back the route path to /thread. By now we have defined two paths, the home page and the threads. If we try to browse a page that doesn't exist, like /posts, we will get an empty page without any information on what's going on. what we want to happen here in a real-world application is to display an error. See for example what you get on ViewSchool.io when you try to browse a page that doesn't exist. This is a nice feature that we should implement in our forum. Let's see how we can do that. To be honest, I always forget the syntax for doing that in ViewRouter, so I will open the router guide and see what we get there. Here they have a route that will match anything. Anything like all the paths of our application. I will copy this route and play with it in our app. I will create a page component to have something to test with. I will call it PageNotFound to comply with the naming convention we are using in our application. In the template, I will just add a heading saying not found. Let's go back to our route file and import the component to use it. Great, let's give it a shot in the browser. It works already, and /posts now says not found. Awesome. It's also important to test that our home page and the thread page still work. And they do. Know that our other registered routes get prioritized over the path match, so it doesn't matter if you put the not found route last or first in your array. I like to have it last. Okay, I will update the template of our not found page quickly and explain a common caveat you might neglect when you are implementing not found functionality on the client side. I will wrap the template in a div with a class of callFull that we use in the rest of the pages. I will also add a link using router link for users to navigate away of the not found page. Let's give it a preview. /posts. Not found. Read some cool threads. Awesome. I want to have the text on the center, so I will use our text center helper. Excellent. Now it's time to explain the caveat. Our implementation of the not found functionality is called Soft404. This is because even though we mention the error and we show the not found page, our application returns a response code of 200 OK. Let me show you this quickly. I will switch to the ViewSchool.io not found page and open the network tab before hitting refresh. Notice that the page in the network is red and comes with an error code of 404 not found. If I open the network and refresh our forum not found, you will notice that the page is white and the status code is 304 OK. When our users visit a page that doesn't exist, what we have here is perfect. But when bots and crawlers visit our website and pages, we could confuse them and sometimes miss out because many bots read the response code and not the content we have on the page. Luckily, Google and Yahoo have reported that they use automated processes to read the content too, so they should be able to understand soft 404s like this one too. However, we cannot return a 404 code from our router because our routing takes place on the client side, after the server has already responded with 200 OK or 304. If you want to return a 404 code, you should configure your server to do that. We will look into that later in the course when we have deployed our application to an online server. For now, we are good with the soft 404. Our not found page will catch all URLs the users visit that we have not defined. But if users try to visit the thread page with an invalid thread ID, then they are stuck with an empty page, and we also get an error in the console. The error says that cannot read property title of undefined. If you want to fix this, you have a lot of options. In this lesson, I will show you a few solutions, including a neat trick that is available only in the newest ViewRouter 4 version. The simplest option is to handle what we display in the page components template. Inside page thread show in the template, we assume that we have a thread. So when we are not able to find one, our code fails. To fix this here, we can wrap our root div element in a v-if and only proceed when we have a thread. This way, if we don't have a thread, we will not get an error in the console and we will still display an empty page to the user. If we want to show them a custom error page, we can do it right here. We can have another div right after the div that displays a thread that we display when we don't have a thread, thus using velse. I will copy the markup for this div from our page not found component. Great, and instead of not found, here we can say this thread does not exist, or this thread is not found. We can keep the link for reading some cool threads. I think this is a good one. Let's confirm that this works in the browser. I will refresh this page, and now we get this custom error, this thread does not exist, and we have the link to go to the homepage. Let's try to visit the thread that we do have, like this one, and it still works. So our solution is good. This approach allows you to customize what you show when a thread does not exist. The downside of this solution is that you might need to repeat this logic for every page you have that relies on a resource, like a thread, a blog post, a category, a user, and so on. But it's fine if you think that it suits your use case. If you want to reuse your page not found component, you still have many options to do that. One solution is to redirect directly to our not found page when the thread does not exist. I'm going to show you how to do it using navigation guards. We will cover navigation guards in detail later in the course. For now, I want to focus on how we can use a route guard to implement this specific feature. Before I do that, I will revert the changes we did in this component. Let's open our router file. Navigation guards allow us to cancel or redirect a route navigation. There are a number of ways to hook into the route navigation process. You can do this globally, per route, or in component. To redirect to the not found page, if the requested thread does not exist, I will use a per route guard called before ender. Per route guards are defined inside the route object in our router file. Navigation guards accept three arguments: the to, which is the route navigating to, the from, which is the route we are navigating away from, and the next, which is a function that we can run to resolve the navigation. The code we will place inside the before ender function will run before router allows the user to enter this route. In here, we want to check if the thread with a specified ID exists. If it exists, we want to allow the navigation to continue uninterrupted. If it doesn't exist, we want to redirect the user to the not found page. Let's implement this step by step. To check if the thread exists in our current setup, we have to look in our data.json file. So we will import our data inside router the same way we import it in our components. I like to call the local variable source data just so we don't confuse it with the component data option. With access to our data now, we can use find to define if the thread exists. To get the ID that is specified in the URL parameters, we will use to.params.id. All URL parameters of the target route are exposed inside route guards under to.params. Here you could make a call to your API if you use one, as we will do later in the course. Next, if the thread exists, we want to continue the navigation normally. We can allow the navigation to continue by calling the next function with no arguments. Great! Now, if the thread doesn't exist, to redirect to the not found page, we will call next and provide it the route to redirect to. Next accepts the same argument as the toProp router link accepts. I will use an object and provide the name of the target route that is not found. That should do. Let's check our work in the browser. First, I will open a thread that exists to ensure that it still works. And it does. Great. Now, I will visit a thread that doesn't exist. And successfully, we are redirected to the not found page. This is great. Oftentimes, though, you want to show the not found page but do not change the URL. This allows the user to fix a typo in the link or review what is the URL that does not exist. Again, there are many ways to do that. I will show you the newest solution that is available in Vue Router 4, which I consider the most simple label-wise. I will open the router guide to begin with. This is the section where we initially copied the path match for our not found page. Below it says, in this specific scenario, we are using a custom regex between parentheses and making the path match param as optionally repeatable. This allows us to directly navigate to the route, if we need to, by splitting the path into an array. This part here is our golden ticket. Below in the code example, they show how to redirect to the not found route and pass along the current URL path using the path match parameter. This is exactly what we need. The object that is passed in router push is the same object we pass when we call the next function. So I will copy this object from here. I notice that it uses this $route, which is what we would use inside the Vue component. But this will not work inside the router guard as we don't have access to this. To access the information of the active route inside our navigation guard, we use the to parameter. This code here will break the active path into an array and will pass it as the value of the path match parameter to our not found page. I know this code might look a bit confusing, but don't worry, that's because it is a bit complicated, as it is all based on regex and the dynamic route matching. You will most likely only need to use this to implement this very feature of not changing the URL of a not found resource. Let's check it out in the browser. I will visit a thread that does not exist. And now we are not redirected to the home page, which is great. I notice though that we have two slashes in the beginning of our URL. I guess that's because the path we pass in the parameters also includes the initial slash. To remove that from the path string before we break it into an array, we can use the substring JavaScript function and remove one character. This should do the trick. Let's check it out in the browser. Awesome! We can now navigate to a non-existing resource and see our not found page without modifying the URL. So users can review the URL and try to fix it if they have made a typo, or just copy and paste it to report the error to you. If you want to make this feature top-notch, you can make it also pass along the query params and the URL hash. For example, if we visit a missing thread, where life equals good and hashtag hello, this should not be stripped out when the resource does not exist, as it happens now. To implement that, we will pass the query and the hash of the current route to the target. We can access both under the to argument. If we check in the browser now, we preserve both the query and the hash. Amazing! And don't worry, you were not supposed to know how to do that. This is a new feature and the documentation is still very new. More and more tips and tricks are being added as time passes. I have also opened the pull request and I'm working on it with Eduardo to improve this specific example. So in the future, you might be able to copy this directly from the docs.